All right, welcome back. This second video is going to focus on this concept of cutback management, or the process of determining what expenses should be reduced within a budget. So far in our unit on budgeting, we've really been talking about budgeting in the context of everyday normal circumstances, right? We talked about this concept of planning for a budget. We talked about wanting to forecast the budget given objective information or historical information. We've identified these different approaches to budgeting as well as the different types of budgets, which is all important, right? It's important foundational information. We want to make sure that we have the ability to develop budgets. But the truth is that at some point, sport organizations are likely going to have to make adjustments to those budgets, right? And that's where this concept of cutback management comes in. And I would argue that it's maybe even more important that sport practitioners have a sound understanding of cutback management as they do the basic budget development process, right? Because pretty much anyone can learn to put together a budget, but those that respond to a problem or a cut in a way that still provides a sound financial situation for your organization is crucial. So I think it's really important that we talk about cutback management and some of the key approaches to that and some of the philosophies and concepts to keep in mind during that process. Okay, so before we look specifically at some of the different methods for making cuts, I think it's important to identify some basic philosophies. So things that sound or wise financial managers do or follow when they're making cuts. So just some things to keep in mind because, of course, no sport practitioner wants to have to make cuts to the budget. Certainly, those aren't easy decisions that are made, but again, it's inevitable. So I think it's important to realize that there are some things that you can do to try to alleviate the harm that comes from those cuts. So three things that we've identified on this slide. One is to involve a variety of stakeholders, right? Ensuring that it's not just a couple of people in the room when you're making those decisions. And often this is unfortunately what happens, right? If it's a college athletic department, it ends up being the athletic director and an associate athletic director making cuts. It's crucial that a variety of stakeholders are invited and included in these conversations, right? Because it's important to consider the different perspectives, right? Whether it's how coaches are going to be impacted by the decisions made, whether it's student athletes that are going to be impacted by the decisions made. It could even be external stakeholders, right? Partners of the organization in the community that are impacted. So really crucial to bring in a variety of stakeholders to those discussions so that all those perspectives are considered before decisions are made. Next one here is consider the long-term effects. Obviously sometimes decisions have to be made in the short term, meaning that in order for a sport organization to continue its operations, they may have to make some difficult cuts in a very short period of time. But it's crucial that when those decisions are being made, the long-term effects of those decisions are considered, right? Because at some point, those long-term effects might have really damaging impact on the sport organization itself. So it's important to look beyond that week or that month or even that year. What impact is this decision going to have on our organization long term? Finally, this goes back to, I think, one of the first slides we looked at in this budgeting unit, and that's the consideration of the values or mission of the sport organization, right? So we said that oftentimes budgeting should be kind of rooted in the values or mission of the sport organization, meaning that the decisions that you make regarding planning and forecasting should ultimately be rooted in your values and mission as an organization. And the same is true when considering cuts, right? So the people that are tasked with making those tough decisions should always re-examine what those values are. What is our mission as an organization? And, do these cuts fall in line with those values and that mission? And if they don't, is this something we need to reconsider? So, always important to kind of reflect and re examine the values and mission of the organization when having discussions about cuts. Okay, so now what I want us to do is focus on some different approaches to cutback management. First of all, notice that there are several different ways in which a sport organization can go about making cuts, right? So there isn't necessarily kind of a one-size-fits-all approach to cutback management, but there are a number of methodologies that can be employed. So it's important for us to, one, identify these different approaches to cutback management, kind of explain what each entails and when they might be appropriate. And then I also want to share some examples of these approaches being used. So we'll go through these one by one here. First and foremost here, across the board cuts. You can probably distill what that means from the title, but just to give you a little bit of context here, an across the board cut would be a percentage cut of the budget that would go department by department, right? Meaning that every department within the sport organization would be taking essentially the same percentage of cut for that budget period. Show you an example here of a recent across the board cut. Indiana University announced here a couple months back that they were going to have a 10% department-wide budget cut after COVID essentially, caused the postponement of fall sports. And very sadly, this is a headline that I could have pulled from a number of universities. This is something we've seen across the country, unfortunately. So this is a problem that a lot of schools are having right now, and an approach that many are using. And, certainly across the board cuts have a little bit of that fair share mentality, right? If we're going to have to make cuts, then we can spread the cuts out across the board, and that alleviates, the cut that has to occur, right? So not just one department is taking that cut. And so I think that's why you're seeing a number of athletic departments going this route, because it does allow them to spread out the cut a bit. Another approach to cutback management is programmatic cuts. So here we're talking about kind of a much more severe approach to cutback management, which actually involves cutting programs, right? And again, unfortunately, these headlines are too common right now. We're seeing a number of college athletic departments cutting entire programs of sports in order to make up for lost funds during COVID. So pulled this example from Stanford, who cut 11 of their varsity sports back in July. So, this is an example of programmatic cuts. Pre-COVID, when I would give this lecture, I would, maybe pull an example of a school cutting 2 or 3 programs, because that was, pretty common when you would see programmatic cuts. But, what we're seeing right now is sort of startling to me, just given the vast impact this is going to have on those schools moving forward, and kind of not knowing what the implications are on those universities, and when it comes to Title IX, and, have all these questions about the long-term impacts. But certainly, program-based or programmatic cuts are certainly more severe approach to cutback management, and of course they're being done because of the massive amount of savings, right? If you cut an entire program, you're cutting that entire program's budget. So certainly allows the university to make up for lost funds in a fairly short order. Okay. Next approach here to cutback management is decreasing administrative costs. So this one, it tends to be a little bit less severe, right? This could be anything from, cutting printing costs, limiting, the budget for each department in terms of how much they can spend on employee cell phone bills, right? These are basically anything related to administrative components of a sport organization and then making cuts to those. So obviously, this is something that's not going to make a huge dent in the budget, but there could be items of waste included in those administrative expense budgets. So this could be a way to make small cuts if you're looking to do so in ways that don't make a huge impact on any one department or the organization as a whole. Okay, next approach here is workforce reduction. Now, obviously, this is fairly straightforward, but there are a couple of different approaches to workforce reduction that I want to identify here. One approach to workforce reduction is staffing levels are reduced through attrition. So this basically just means, someone retires or leaves their position and then the company doesn't fill that position, right? That's one way to manage workforce reduction. Probably more common are things like firings, right? So the complete elimination of a position currently held by an employee. A layoff or a furlough, which is essentially a temporary leave for the employee due to some kind of economic force or current event. And, unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of these right now in the sport industry, especially for college athletic departments that might be on pause, not actually playing any sports. You've seen a number of those departments institute furloughs where they ask employees to essentially leave temporarily or take a certain number of days off throughout the year as a cost-saving measure. Other workforce reduction methods could be hiring freeze, right? Like not hiring any more employees for a sustained period of time. I just talked to someone with the Cavaliers the other day who I'm working with on a project, and he said they're just on a hard hiring freeze for, indefinitely, essentially, until they know more about what the next NBA season looks like. So I think starting to see a lot of those too as a preventative measure. And those are, again, some of the common workforce reduction methods that you might see employed. Like I said, COVID is obviously having a big impact on this aspect of cutback management. This isn't something that's only impacting college athletic departments. I know that's the example I've been using a lot, but we're also seeing some pro teams impacted by this. So you might have seen back in September, the Red Sox laid off more than 40 employees. And, that's a pretty major cut for a professional sports team. And you can see basically 10% of their full-time staff. So this isn't something that's just occurring in college athletics. It's also occurring at the professional level as a way to reduce costs. Okay, consolidating or centralizing functions is another approach to cutback management. So this could be done in a number of different ways. You could centralize job functions, right? So have employees that used to work maybe doing two different jobs, combining those jobs into one function. Give you an example of that. One of our former students who's working with the Blackhawks now, he was telling a group of students in a networking session earlier this semester that the Blackhawks cut about 8 of their full-time sales staff. And so his job, which used to be focused only on selling, now includes 50% servicing. So basically they cut a bunch of service jobs and now their sales reps are doing both sales and service. So that's an example of kind of consolidating and centralizing job functions, right? This can also be done for facilities or real estate, right? If companies looking to cut costs, they might shut down or sell a piece of the company or facility that's no longer generating revenue, right? And they might consolidate any sports or activities that were normally taking place in that facility in a different facility. So that particular approach can be applied to a number of things, but the underlying idea there is that you are, consolidating things that were costing you money in a way that is saving you money. Finally, here, this last approach to cutback management is outsourcing, right? So the organization is trying to determine what it can outsource, right? What is it that is costing us a lot of money to do that we can simply outsource for someone else to do or another company to do? There are a number of sport agencies, sport marketing agencies like IMG Learfield that allow sport organizations to outsource things like ticket sales or sponsorship sales. That would be a good example of that, right? So if a college athletic department said, hey, we can no longer afford to pay a sales staff, they might outsource that particular function to a company like Learfield, which would then, have an arrangement with them where they are essentially, selling those tickets, but they will obviously take a cut of that. But, certainly outsourcing can be a way to save money for an organization, especially if they're struggling in the short term. Okay, so those were the approaches to cutback management. Again, that list isn't necessarily all encompassing. Those are just some of the common approaches utilized within the sport within the sport industry itself. And we'll talk a little bit more about those approaches to cutback management here at the end. But for now, I want us to highlight some other budget adjustment considerations. So basically, in addition to thinking about some of those main philosophical things that we talked about earlier when it comes to cutback management, once decisions are made surrounding cuts, there are some other considerations, right? First and foremost, are these cuts going to be short term or long term, right? And then how does that impact our current budget planning? How does that impact future budget planning, right? So there are details that need to be sorted out, right, in terms of whether or not these cuts are just a short term to get through the existing budget period or if these are going to be long term cuts. And that will ultimately impact long term planning for the organization. Next one here is how are our stakeholders impacted, right? And this one, we mentioned the importance of having stakeholders involved in those initial budget meetings regarding cutbacks, but it's also important to consider the impacts of these decisions on the various stakeholders of your organization, right? And once you identify how those stakeholders are going to be impacted, what can be done to alleviate any pain that might be caused. I showed you the Red Sox example a few slides back about how they cut 40 employees. And, if you read into the article a little bit closer, you see that, they have implemented a number of, programs to help alleviate some of the harm done to those people, whether it be severance pay that they're offering or job assistance, finding another career. That's an example of sort of taking into account those stakeholders. When college athletic departments cut entire programs, obviously you have student athletes that are impacted immediately, right? They've lost their opportunity to play the sport they love. They've lost their scholarship. They have to reconsider everything. And so for the athletic department to think about that key stakeholder group and, the different things they can do to try to minimize or alleviate that pain, whether it's allowing them to have another year of scholarship until they have to move or find something else, some other financial help. Those kinds of things are important and certainly impact the sport organization from a PR perspective as well when they do take the time to consider those stakeholders and take steps to alleviate harm. And finally, a key question that has to be a part of these cutback management discussions is what can be done to generate more revenue or help offset these losses, right? And this is something that might require time and planning, but it's important that sport organizations are thinking long term, that they're thinking creatively about how they can increase revenue, especially if they're faced with a situation like COVID or another situation that creates, a huge shortfall for them. What can they be doing to try to identify new lines of revenue to offset those losses? And that's something that should obviously be ongoing and something we mentioned back in our unit on financial risk, right? The importance of having forward thinking business planning. And that is of particular importance when we're talking about budget shortfalls and being able to kind of weather the storm in the instance that those things occur. And we know they will, we know they do inevitably. All right. So we've covered a lot of ground here over the last 2 weeks when it comes to budgeting. Again, we've talked about budgeting from a kind of conceptual basis. We've talked about budgeting from a more applied basis. We've covered a lot in terms of budgeting. One thing that we haven't really covered yet, but I want to make sure that you get some practice with, is using Excel as a way to develop and manage a budget. Some of you probably have already used Excel to manage your own personal budgets. Maybe you've used Excel within your own internships or GA positions, and that's great. I know every student has their own, different levels of comfort and experience with Excel, and I'll probably assess that using a poll when we get together in class next time, just to gauge where we're all at. But I do want to mention that, in order to be able to complete the budget proposal assignment and the in-class budget negotiations, you are going to have to do some basic things in Excel. And I've kind of listed those here. Again, I'm not going to be asking you to develop a budget from scratch. Essentially, you're going to be given an existing budget, and you're going to have to make some changes to that budget as you work through the budget negotiations with your groups. And again, we'll talk more in detail about what that looks like this next class session. But I just wanted you to be aware of that component. And with that, your practice case this week is going to allow you to play around a little bit in Excel with the budget. So you are going to get some practice doing that, and we'll probably do even a little more practice when we get together in class. So just wanted to bring that to your attention, that Excel is an important component to budgeting, and most sport organizations are using either Excel or some other type of software similar to Excel to manage their budget. So it is important that we get a little bit of practice there in that regard, so that when you do get to that major budget proposal and negotiation, that you're comfortable managing that. Okay, real quick wrap up here. I know we've covered a lot this week, but just a few things to keep in mind as we kind of summarize or bring this budgeting unit to a close. And that's that budgeting is really a tool, and it's a tool that most sport practitioners are going to have to use at some point in their career, whether it's being asked to develop a department budget or just making adjustments to a budget because cuts have to be made, right? At some point, you will likely be involved in some aspect of budgeting. So again, important that you understand some of the basics when it comes to the various stages of the budgeting process, as well as the different approaches to budgeting. And then finally, when it comes to cutback management, that you make sure that you're aware of the different ways in which cuts can be made, as well as some of those underlying principles that really should be guiding a lot of that decision-making process. Okay, that's all I have for you this week. Hope you have a great week. Thanks.